It's your future with Joyce Gioia. Want to know what's coming and how to prepare for it? This show is for you. Armed with this information and these insights, our host Joyce Gioia will help you make better decisions both personally and professionally. Joyce will cover all the trends, from social to economic, to workforce, and more. You will have a chance to get your questions answered in a segment we call, I'm Glad You Asked. This is one show you can't afford to miss. Now on Futurist Television. It's your future with Joyce Gioia.
Hello and welcome to It's Your Future with Joyce Gioia. I'm Rom Gayoso, co-host. We're broadcasting via Futurist Television, the home of the future on television. If you're listening to the show via podcast or watching us on TV, you too can be part of the conversation. Just visit our YouTube channel, and that is IMCI Magazine, where we continue to chat about the topic of the day. You can access this information on our website, and that is www.futuristelevision.com. So don't be shy. We transmit via Roku TV, and that is the Roku app, the memory stick, or the TV sets, and via Apple TV. So don't forget to add Futurist Television to your preferred list of channels using your Apple TV device. You can also listen to the show via Radio Futures, the wave of the future on the radio. Today, our topic is Enterprise Agility. And for that, we'll speak with Erich Bühler from the Enterprise Agility University and curator of the Enterprise Agility World Conference. So let me say a few words about the show. If you have a question about what's coming and would like to find out how to prepare for it, then worry no more. Our host, Joyce Gioia, will share lots of valuable information, thought-provoking ideas, and some great insight about a variety of topics. And she will cover several emerging trends. And armed with this information and these insights, you are sure to make better decisions. So without further ado, let's welcome Joyce Gioia to the show. How are you doing today, Joyce?
I'm just great. Thank you, Rom. It's great to be back. The last time that we talked, I was in Dubai.
On the other side of the world, I guess. And we had such a wonderful talk with Mads. So I will not terrorize Erich, but he should know that I tried to make the last guest Yodo on television. But it's okay. We'll survive. So let me say a few words about Erich before we actually introduce him to the audience. So he is the founder and director at the Enterprise Agility University, an agile consultant and author of Leading Exponential Change. He worked as an agile and scrum coach in Europe, in Asia, and South America. He talks about leadership, change management, and enterprise agility. Well, without further ado, let's welcome Erich to the show. How are you doing today, Erich?
Hello, Rom. It's very nice to have you here. I feel this is a good place to be.
It's a very good place to be.
How wonderful to have you, and thank you so much for taking the time. And of course, in between the questions, I hope you can tell us a little bit about the conference, the upcoming conference. I can't wait to hear more about it. So, Joyce, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rom. I certainly will ask Erich about the conference. So, Erich, just as an introduction, our relationship has been the definition of agility. We've had to move very quickly in order to make this experience happen. So thank you so much for personally being agile, and the fact that you walk your talk is important, I know. Tell us a little bit about your journey. Where did you grow up, and how did you get to be a philanthropist?
Well, the first thing we need to understand is that different paths take in different direction, but I think all the paths should go in the same direction, which is to try to improve the well-being of organizations and try to make sure that when organizations are exposed to exponential change, they can deal with that. In my case, I would say I'm dyslexic, also, which is a problem. I'm hyperactive, and when I was a kid, they told me you cannot learn English. So I always believed that I would not be able. And I started learning English when I was 28 years old. I make a lot of mistakes, but I think people can understand me. And one of the things we see in organizations, specifically when we are moving, and this is something I learned, is that sometimes we believe that we have certain restrictions, but those restrictions are what we believe about ourselves, right? And then when we are exposed now to constant changes, many people have superpowers. And part of that is also discovering your superpowers.
Very true. And one of my favorite books is called Illusions by Richard Bach. And in it, there is a Messiah's Handbook. And in the Messiah's Handbook, it says, argue your limitations, and sure enough, they're yours. Because
Yeah,
when we unlimit ourselves, so much more can happen, right?
and I remember I was flying one day. That was probably, I think, 6 months ago. I was flying from was California to Panama, and I arrived at 3 in the morning. There was nobody at the airport. There was just one lady, and the lady asked me, Eric, oh, and she didn't know my name. Hey, do you mind staying with me because the airport is empty, 3 in the morning? So I started talking to her, and she told me that she was struggling to get a job for probably 6 months, and she was a product manager, and she was feeling that she knew how to do the job, but she was not getting any job at all. So I said, imagine 3 in the morning at the airport. I said, okay, what about you show me your LinkedIn and you show me your CV, and we take a look at that. So while I was having a conversation with her, I realized she had very, very good soft skills. She was great at talking to people. She was great at expressing. I said, but it doesn't say anything about this in your CV, on your LinkedIn. And then just after a kind of further research, I found that she had so many skills, but none of those skills were on the CV,
Profile.
or on
Mhm.
LinkedIn. And many of the things that happen, especially when situations are changing all the time, is that we don't know what we can offer until we discover it. And sometimes to discover it, the others have to tell you, because you don't know that you are good at doing something, right? And this is one of the important things with companies which are changing all the time. We need to rediscover not just the skills from those people, but obviously the skills to support organization, to support the ecosystem, and to make sure that when everything changes, we are ready and prepared for the new situation, right? That which requires also, like as you said, a little bit of mental agility to realize that situations change, and you have two options. You can feel frustrated, or you can feel happy because you have a new situation to face.
Indeed. Now, this conference is called the Enterprise Agility World Conference, but how do you define enterprise agility?
Well, this is something that, from my perspective, and I will do a little bit of story, my personal story here. In 2002, if you take a look at 2002, the Agile Manifesto, it was great because it provided certain ideas, but companies are completely different nowadays. Now, if you take a look at these folks from 2001, 2002, they were all male. They were all coming just from one or two countries, which is nothing wrong. But then the diversity in organizations nowadays is completely different. And then they were all coming from software. So when you take a look at organizations, you have to take a look at the organization in a more systemic way, with more people coming from different paths, different ways, from different kind of people. So we cannot solve or provide solutions, even if it's a good starting point. From my perspective, you cannot provide a solution when it's really biased. Even though it was great, but organizations are completely different. We are based on diversity. We are based on equity. We are based on neurodiversity. And then what happened after that is around 2012, or between 2010 and 2012, I was in London, working in London at that time. People started trying to expand those ideas from Agile to the rest of the organization. Now,
Hmm.
what happened when you expand something, you also expand the restrictions of that, and you expand the good things and the bad things. So we cannot find a solution just by trying to expand something which is already restricted from my perspective. So enterprise agility provides foundations in the sense that provides the science behind, includes diversity, includes neurodiversity, try to understand how the brain works when you are exposed, so people are exposed to constant changes, and also try to offer different types of leadership that maybe did not exist at that time. We are in a different world. And from my perspective, enterprise agility is a capacity of the whole organization to confront those exponential changes, but with high levels of organizational health or well-being. Because obviously, if there is no high well-being, companies cannot adapt.
I think you just answered in answering that question. I think you answered my next question, but let's see. My next question was, how did enterprise agility become the focus of your work? And I think that what I heard you say was that you saw a need and that sort of drew you into this work. Is that accurate?
Well, first of all, I would say yes, it's accurate. And one of the things that since I discovered Joyce, I love is that there are not many people who understand the value of well-being in organizations in terms of being something concrete, because everyone talks about well-being, but then when things are are complex and there are pressure from the market, everyone forgets about well-being, everyone forgets about diversity, everyone forgets about neurodiversity, and this is what generally happens. Now, when I published my book in 2000 and beginning of 2017 or 18, what I did after is I traveled around the world. I took like 7 months traveling, and I asked a few questions to change consultant in different latitudes. I went to China, I was in America, I was in Europe, and then I asked them, what do you find you are struggling with? And then what I found there was slightly interesting. The first one was resistant to change. People do not want to change. And that was important. And the second one, this is kind of external. I mean, people do not want to change, but the second one was, I cannot lead people to go in a different direction. So and I realized that if you cannot lead yourself because you don't know which direction you're going, then obviously you cannot lead others. So I started realizing there, and I know you agree, because I 100% know that you're on the same page, is that in order to lead an organization, you need to be a good influencer, obviously, right? And you need to lead yourself, because if you cannot lead yourself, then it's very difficult. And then I started to figure out why. And obviously, the first reason why you cannot lead is because the markets are changing constantly, and we are not physiologically prepared for the constant alterations in processes, tools, and ways of working. And then I started working and collaborating with some scientists, like neuroscientists, and trying to rediscover what to do. And I started trying to analyze how the brain processes information when you are exposed to constant changes, which is different than when you are very relaxed. And this is strictly connected to what we mentioned before. And I know, as I said, you are on the same page, that without higher levels of well-being, companies cannot adapt to constant changes in organizations. So if you see at organizations, you might probably also see that when companies talk about well-being, they maybe talk about some team building activities, or maybe paying for the gym for some people, or giving some little flexibility to come 1 hour or 2 hours late or earlier. But what about real well-being? And this is something we saw in the pandemic, where companies were forcing people to do certain things, so people have to work from home, and they did not even have the tools or whatever. So what I was trying to find out at that point is why people could not lead. And I imagine the reason why people cannot lead is because in Agile, there are so many things which are missing. So first of all, Agile do not talk about any kind of market changing, highly changing markets. And there we have practices which stop working when you are, for example, everyone loves retrospectives, right? Doing retrospective. But then retrospective work very well if people have the time to reflect, and the changes are, you have long periods of time. But what if the market are changing all the time? You cannot do retrospectives every hour.
Right.
And this is where the stories start changing.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me that enterprise agility can actually help accelerate change. Is that true? And
Yes, and
how?
not just accelerate change, because accelerating change also means that you make better decisions. So accelerating change is also making better decisions. So let me tell you what we did last year. So with some research, we found that the in certain leaders, brains were working in different ways, and we tried to discover why. Very successful leaders compared to other leaders that maybe were not very successful, and but there were some specific type of leaders that they were doing great when they were exposed to exponential change. And what we discovered was that leaders with what we call higher intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is that if you are wrong, you don't care. You're okay. You celebrate you are wrong, and we started seeing that when leaders have higher intellectual humility, which is different than humility. Humility is something you were born. Intellectual humility is something you practice. When you are exposed to changes, you have a lot of information irradiating from the markets. Now, what happened is leaders with higher levels of intellectual humility, they accepted more information because they were okay if they were wrong and they celebrated it. The research also shows that they integrate on board more collaborators to ask for feedback, to try to get them on board to do activities, etc. And then there is also different activation of the brain in certain areas which evaluate data coming from the environment. So at that point, we released a model, a framework, which is called the Lighthouse model, which helps leaders in organizations increase the levels of um, intellectual
Intellectual
humility.
humility, right? Sounds like it might be a good topic for a trend alert.
Well, we can talk about this for hours, right?
My Herman trend alert is something that I'm always looking for new ideas, new concepts, new insights for. So, Erich, it feels like the world is changing too fast already. Is it important to accelerate change? And I think you said no. It's that we need to help people to accept change, right?
Yes, and accepting change, we also need to understand what happens in your body when you accept change. If you accept change, but then you are not prepared for that, then your levels of cortisol in your brain increase. Now, what happens is, let's go back to the intellectual humility. A person with higher intellectual humility, if the person want to go in one direction and something goes wrong or is at the wrong direction, the person just corrects and says, this is okay. So in your brain, what happens is there is a self-regulation of certain hormones. And there are specifically two hormones. One is cortisol. Cortisol is this hormone. I know many of you folks know it, but then maybe some of you don't know. When you are exposed to a situation when there is, some danger, you feel like threatened, then cortisol levels go up. Now, what happens when cortisol levels go up, and this happens in companies when the situation is changing all the time, and we have the chronic one, which is a company where everything is changing all the time and you're not prepared, and you have the one where there is a market disruption, a surprise, and then cortisol levels go up. When the levels of cortisol go up, the number of dimensions or perspectives a person can evaluate narrows. Okay, so and this is very interesting. In general, a person can evaluate 5, 6 perspectives. But imagine you open your door and then there is a lion. The only perspective you are going to evaluate at that point is to run away. And this is the same that happens when you are exposed to constant changes. So the higher the levels of cortisol in the brain, the less perspective this person can evaluate. So this is bad for decision making. Now, the lower the levels of cortisol, and there are other chemicals also that are related to focus that I will mention in a few seconds. Then the more perspective you can evaluate. Obviously, in a exponential market, you want to evaluate more perspective, but it has to be sustainable, and this is a very important thing. Now, you can change, and you can change all the time. You have, as you said, you have to accept change, but accepting change also means accepting if you are able to cope with that, and if you're not able to cope with that, you have to reflect if that's the right place in the organization, if you can improve it. For example, If you take it from the neurological point of view, and this is what we call neuro exponential profiles, you have two kind of learners: the quick learners and the reflective learners. If you put a quick learner close to the market, yes, this person can learn very quickly. But if you're a reflective learner, you're gonna feel very frustrated. Now, an organization cannot be just with quick learners because they don't go too deep. So the question is, if we have the right people in the right time, so the closer you go to the exponential market, the faster are changes. And the inside you go, if you go inside the organization, you see less changes. So answering your question, I believe that in order to be prepared for exponential change, first you have to accept, become aware of how good you are at changing. And the second thing is, how do you feel? Do I feel frustrated when everything changes? Do I feel certain emotions? And how I can manage my emotions?
That's really interesting because it gets back to my premise about experience rules and my new book. Because what you're saying is that we have to pay attention to the experience that is happening on the part of the individuals in the organization who are going to support the change and growth or not, right?
Yeah, and I think you have the first person who want to purchase your book here for some time,
well,
because I'm
well,
really
I have the proof of it, but not the books themselves. But yes,
well.
indeed, of course. Thank you.
I think I want it because, as I said, we're on the same page, and I believe that the problem is companies have been focused on some kind of mechanical things, and they forget about experience, how the experience looked like. And experience also means that you are able to focus on this experience. And one of the things we know is that when levels of cortisol are high, um, if you start feeling fear, afraid of the situation, and you start focusing on what's going to happen in the future, obviously, and then you start, there is a chemical which is called acetylchlorine, which is in the brain, and this is restricted. This chemical is restricted. If I try to focus for a long period, this chemical start going down until I cannot focus anymore. That's why we need to take breaks. But one of the important things here is, the higher the levels of cortisol, the lower the levels of this chemical is. So you start projecting yourself in the future instead of projecting yourself in the experience, as you said. And as the levels of this chemical start going down, you cannot focus anymore. And this is what you see, that you're very stressed, that you cannot focus on anything. And this is very important. And that's why focusing on the experience, and I imagine you have certain also recommendations for that, is important.
Yes,
All
indeed.
righty. We
Let's.
have a couple of questions from the floor.
Okay.
So we have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. So first one, Manoranjan, and he's saying, the importance of, so you're picking up a new language, writing a book, and it's about neurodiversity. So I think, when you talk about, embracing change, so I would like to hear you a little bit of your advice and your comment on this one, because people nowadays travel quite a lot. So changing cultures, changing languages. So basically, you are the example of someone who embraced change and agility, right? You know what? I'm in a different culture. I'm in a different language. It did not bother you. I'm going to write the book no matter what. So what's your thought on embracing change for someone who's actually changing languages and changing cultures?
Well, first of all, I don't see much different with changing in a company, because a company changing languages is similar to changing situations. You need to be exposed to a new situation, and also changing cultures. I remember when I arrived a few years ago, I arrived to Hong Kong to help a company there. I had to stay a few months, and I just went outside the airport, and I said, well, now what? I don't speak any Cantonese. I'm gonna deal with this for 8 months. So, and this is the same feeling that a person has in an organization when everything is changing. There is not much difference. The only difference here is that we are moving from leading others to lead myself. which is an important perspective, because every time, there is a say probably similar in English, which says something like, "Do what I say, not what I do." Um, and this is quite important, because leading yourself is the hardest challenge that you have during exponential change. And now there are certain initial limitations. Now everyone has limitations. The problem is your limitations are not where you think they are. Okay, and Sun Tzu said the enemy is not where you believe it is, and this is something important. So whatever we want to do, we need to understand how the brain works. We need to understand that there is some initial internal or external um, blockages. And in fact, there is a very interesting research from Antonio Nagel in 2012, which shows that in order for you to become aware of your thought, it takes 220 milliseconds. But 110 milliseconds, your amygdala activates and starts adding negative thought into your brain. So at the time you become aware of it, you are already biased. So at the time you want to learn a language or you want to go in a different direction, someone already was telling you, and this is something we generally see with managers, where some consultant go to companies and they say, "Oh, the company is going to be all flat." You know what happened with that? That these people have prestige or power at there, and when people feel that they lose prestige or they lose power, this is one of the highest activation in the amygdala. The amygdala completely floods your brain with cortisol, and then what happens then? First of all, the number of perspectives, as I said, is reduced. Second, the amygdala start adding some thoughts, as for example, Eric, now the company is flat. You have to pay the bill for, your place, your kids, the school. You're not going to be able to pay that. So these guys are bastards. Don't like this. Don't trust these guys. And then after that, you become aware of this. And this work with everything, with a language, in a company, etc. And this is very important to understand. Mental agility, we define different types of agility, but there is a specific type of agility, which is mental agility. Mental agility always requires to embrace and to understand how your feelings affects your way of thinking.
Well, talking about feelings, the other questions are about soft skills. So one comment from Tom here is, how does intelligence humility connect with vulnerability? And your thoughts on the lighthouse model?
Oh, I love Tom, because also Tom is a person who had some situation in his life, and he had to completely change the way he lived his life. So thank you, Tom, for that. So one of the things that we need to understand is we are quite vulnerable. I'm quite vulnerable here, speaking a foreign language and I confuse all the time right with left, the names of people, the days, the times. Now you need to know when to be vulnerable and how. It's not the same being vulnerable in front of your girlfriend, in front of the CEO, in front of people you don't know. Some consultants recommend leaders becoming a little bit more vulnerable, but it does not need to be in the same way everywhere, because exposing yourself everywhere is not a good idea. Now, we also know in some companies, approximately in financial companies, and this is something we can talk at any other time, 25% of people in those organizations are psychopathic people. You don't want to expose being
I'm not so
vulnerable to psychopathic people, right? So you have to be vulnerable and you have to have intellectual humility. But you also need to make sure that intellectual humility is about saying, I'm wrong, but also about stating your boundaries. Okay, I was wrong here,
Mm.
but there is a boundary here. I'm so sorry, I cannot go in any other direction. Um, I saw a video from Barack Obama putting some limit in a very, I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking just about how, some politicians communicate the boundaries. And some people are great at placing boundaries in a positive way. It doesn't mean that this is a limit, I'm not going in that direction. So I think that being vulnerable, there are different ways of being vulnerable. You can also test the waters to see how vulnerable you can be, and that you are wrong. There is something very important here, and I will tell you what the research says. A person with higher levels of intellectual humility, when other person talk to this person, the brain of the other person in the first 3 to 4 seconds see that person, the other person closer, and in general increase the levels of dopamine in the brain, which increases trust. So if the other person can see that you have higher levels of intellectual humility, the effect that the communication with the other person is better. It doesn't mean you work with everyone, but the connection is better. So if you are a little bit vulnerable, the other person is going to take in a better way if you have higher levels of intellectual humility.
Let's stay in this issue of trust. So Tom had a different kind of comment, and I think can accept change, but and I'm more analytical and it takes time. I think I don't accept change when I sense mistrust from the change maker. So you said trust, but now what is the impact of the absence of trust?
Well, first of all, the absence of trust includes that you move there are certain kind of and this is something that the scientific community debates, but at the end of the day, when there is absence of trust, there are two things you do. You are more methodical in trying to follow certain step with those people, and you use more indirect ways of communication. You send emails, you just try to leave some, you know, kind of um, you try to leave somewhere what you told this person, even in some kind of system or voice or text or whatever. And when there is mistrust, the levels of dopamine drop, the levels of cortisol increase again. And then when that happens, you start wearing more for, for you, and you start not liking the other person. Maybe the other person is great. Maybe it is just you. Sometimes you meet someone and you say, I don't like this person. I don't know why. And maybe you're wrong. But what we have seen is that there are also micro gestures. So your face produces hundreds of micro gestures. When someone says, I don't like this person, this is not magic. It's because your subconscious is getting the micro gestures, the facial micro gesture from that person. This is something you cannot detect. There are some techniques in science where you put some cables on the face and you can start detecting them. But then when you don't trust someone, it can be because it can be three things basically. There are more because the person did something to you, because you live or you believe you lived a similar situation. This is what we say in Spanish: when you burn your tongue with hot milk, you see a cow and you cry. And this is what happens, right? That if you're exposed to similar situations, so your brain is constantly comparing what we call low definition memories with high
Hmm.
definition memories. So imagine you open the door again and there is a lion. If we look at the lion and we say, okay, it has two legs, it looks like a cat. Well, it's not a cat. Well, maybe, you're dead. So we have something called low definition memories, right? And then he tried to, and many times with teams, this is what happened. They have a very painful situation, different, but in their memories, with this quick thinking, they need to compare. And this is something that I'm sure is in Joyce's book, which is about trying to stop and think slower, right? Because if you stop, instead of just getting this, you question yourself, hold on, why I'm thinking this, right? And
Okay,
this is
I
what we call
so
strategic thinking.
we have another question about the chemicals of the body. Can you control the cortisol at all?
Well, I would answer that in 1 second because I want to hear what Joyce mentioned about the. I know you have a lot of with experiences, right? How this one connect, and maybe you can bring some light here.
I have like 2 or 3 chapters in my book on neuroscience. So
Well, that's
yes,
good.
it is covered in the book. However, I'd like to answer this question because I wanted to discuss with you the whole issue of cortisol. Now, cortisol is released in the body when we have stress, correct?
Yeah, well, there are certain situations where you have lower relief, like when you wake up in the morning, you could not jump out of bed, but let's ignore this kind of situations, right?
Yes, I'm talking about when the cortisol is spiking.
Yes, exactly. Because of stress or changes in the market, or you lose prestige, or you lose power.
Yes, anything that makes us feel upset in any way. But what I wanted to do was to draw the relationship between the cortisol and what you talked about before, well-being, because they are very related. Because the more stress we have, the more cortisol we release, and therefore the more inflammation that we have in the body. And what happens then is that it results in pain somewhere in the body. Yes, correct? And it, in a practical sense, it ends up resulting in higher absenteeism, lower productivity, all of those things that you talked about. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I think something very important you said is your body do not or does not distinguish between physical pain and emotional pain. It's the same area of your brain. So, I can pinch myself and I feel some pain, but also someone can do something to me and it's the same area of the brain activating. And this is very important. And when you have a situation, and this is very important when we start practicing intellectual humility, the areas of the brain that activate when you are exposed to a situation where you feel you're wrong are similar to the areas of the brain that activate where you feel pain or threatened because of something, right?
Yes.
Um, and there are techniques to reduce cortisol also.
Right. I was just going to mention that answering Manoranjan's question, and that is, yes, we are able to reduce that stress, and we can do it by meditation and certain forms of exercise, making a deliberate attempt to feel centered with ourselves. Every morning I do priming, which is an exercise from Tony Robbins that allows me to be able to handle greater changes in my day, greater stressors. And yes, there are definitely things that individuals can do. Actually, in Japan, sometimes they do them as a team, right? But in the US, we typically would do them as individuals. We would make sure that we take the time to take care of ourselves, our emotional well-being, right? First. So I'm going to go back to my
Yeah.
questions. Talk a little bit about Enterprise Agility University.
Well, it has been a long journey to try to discover around the world who are doing great things and try to move the industry in a different direction. At the time, after I published my book in 2018, I realized that there was just a few people around the world talking about exponentiality, talking about how to grow into a sustainable in a sustainable direction, how to integrate so many things that it looked ridiculous at that point, like meditation, as you said, or other things. And that if you go to Asia, you find that it's normal. Maybe in the first half an hour you wake up, you don't switch on your phone. You just take some time. You do some meditation. You do some focusing. We started seeing that there is a lot of research, but somehow companies um, I think they are starting to take that on board. I remember once I recommended, we saw a direct relationship between oxygenation levels in your brain and performance. In fact, if you have a company where people work standing for some periods of time, there are some research which shows an increase in productivity because like when you are sitting, you just oppress the area where you do a kind of shallow breathing, and then levels of oxygenation in your brain decrease. Now, what happened also is when you are very stressed, levels of oxygenation also decrease. Now, I started realizing that not many people were talking about these things, and it could be two things I wanted at that point. The first one is to try to start including more science and coming up with new models. And the second is start to meeting what I call the friends around the world who are working on similar things, and try to do a kind of network, because obviously you cannot do alone. Barely the only thing you can do alone is to change yourself. That's obviously going to influence others. And then we started with the first edition of the conference last year. But the idea is to promote that there are other people around the world and also work on this. So the Enterprise Agility University, they try to integrate science into organizational change, but in a way that, for example, is easy. It's easy for companies. For example, we have one of the models for managers, because you cannot expect that everyone want to improve their mindset. Okay, there are people who just go to work, they want to work, and they don't care, and they just leave. That's a reality, and it's okay. This is their option. So we have to also work on frameworks based on behavioral psychology, where we tell people, okay, you have to have this behavior here, and as long as you do this, it works in an ecosystem. So obviously, organizations are very complex, and you cannot solve, with very with the current frameworks. Current, I'm talking about the one from 2001, or based on those ones, with an organization, because organizations are very complex. So the idea of the Enterprise Agility University was to provide the foundations to move in a different direction, and also to connect people doing similar things from around the world to move industry in a different direction too.
Okay, so your Enterprise Agility World Conference is scheduled for this Saturday and Sunday, and I am privileged to be one of your speakers on Sunday morning. I'm looking forward to that. I'm talking about how organizations will change and how what they need to do in order to embrace that change and move forward. And I'm going to be giving them some tools, futurist tools as well, for looking at that. Will you tell us a little bit about the wide variety of other types of presentations that you're going to have in that 2-day conference?
Well, first I would start saying that also it has translation into 36 languages, because you cannot move the industry in a different direction. It's just one language understand. So I'm glad that you are joining, because your conference is going to be translated in several languages. We have people from all around the world joining. Now, the idea is we're going to have the conferences, but we do also have inspirational talks during this conference. We have conferences that are more scientific, someone who did a research and came up with certain ideas. We have someone who are presenting, their conclusions of the books and the techniques and all these kind of things. So we try to keep a balance, because not everyone is in the journey, not everyone is on the same path or in the same place. And there is a common denominator for all people in the conference. The first one is they are providing something new and different. And the second is that it's actionable, and they speak in words that people can understand. So something I talked to some neuroscientists joining, and I said, you can come. In fact, everyone passed the speaker through a blind process. So none of us knew that it was you or it was someone else, and we voted it, but they voted. I did not vote, and they were selected for the conference. But the idea is that people can understand the message too.
Oh yes, for sure. So Erich, this is a TV show about the future. What do you see as the future of enterprise agility?
Well, the future, I think, is here. But if we talk even in the future already, well, one of the things that for me is crucial and is in enterprise agility is neurodiversity. So companies have superpowers, and I will tell you something very interesting. One of the things that exponential companies need is to be able to recognize patterns in the market. Now, they can use artificial intelligence, but obviously at the moment it's a little bit restricted. But now we know already that there are certain people with certain characteristics that they can see patterns. For example, if you are talking about overactive people, they generally have the way the brain works, they can see patterns. There are other people with different neurological or neurocharacteristic of features that they can do that. So one of the things that we have been ignoring because we did not have the data is or the knowledge is neurodiversity. Now, for example, I can see something and I can detect a pattern in a matter of seconds, but some people cannot do it. So all these kind of thing, there are some people who are quick learners, other people who are reflective learners, and they can go even deeper, but they are very bad at learning something. There are other people who are more process oriented, other people are more creative oriented. Now, all these patterns we have seen, there are many different patterns, and this is what we call a neuro exponential profile, allows companies to define where people have to be, what's the value of this, and what the superpowers are. So from my perspective, in an organization, obviously you have the skills that that person has. You also have, if you have to choose between two people, you can see other things, the language they speak, if they can communicate better with the team, how much you are going to pay to that person, and if the culture of that person matches the culture of the organization. But now we have a completely new dimension, which is neuro skills or capabilities, and for me the future of organization has two different things. The first one is the neuro capabilities that allow organizations to work better, and the second, in the areas of department where people do not have higher levels of mental agility. This is an important topic. Companies, from my perspective, where their employees do not have high levels of mental agility, they will not be able to survive. And in here, we know how to measure mental agility. Now, in the department where people do not have, we know that areas which have been doing the same for years, these connections on the neurons, they get kind of fixed. So we need to move slowly people in that different direction. It happens if you do the same for a long time. And from my perspective, if you have department where people are going to take a while to acquire higher levels of mental agility, this is where the magnification of artificial intelligence takes into play to help those departments do, like an external brain, what they cannot do.
Wow. Neuroagility, another good buzzword for me to write about. So
you have a new book now.
As we end our time together, I have a couple more questions. What advice would you give to employees who want to be successful as we move into the future?
I think the first thing and the most important thing is to lead yourself.
Okay. Short and sweet. And finally, and then we'll get back to Ram, and perhaps there's some more questions from the audience as well. What advice can you give to leaders who want to be successful? Because our world seems to be increasingly complex as we move into the future.
Well, one of the differences, and this is something, we have a framework called the M leadership framework, M from mobilizing. One of the things we generally see is when the situations are changing all the time, people stop mobilizing. So as a leader, you struggle and people say, listen, I don't care what's happening. Tell me what to do, and I do it. And people stop mobilizing. So leaders need different skills to keep mobilizing people when everything changes, because obviously levels of cortisol can ramp up and people stop mobilizing, start focusing on the process. But there is a specific, very, very, very specific skill that a leader needs, which is completely different than linear markets, which is, in a linear market, you build trust as a leader by not breaking promises. Now,
Right.
when you're exposed to, and this is, already that this is kind of the basics of any leadership style, right?
Make
Now, in the next,
promises and keep them. Yes.
exactly. Now, when the market changes, you start breaking promises. So a good leader in an exponential market is a leader who knows how to break promises but at the same time increase trust.
Wow. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that if a leader has a high degree of empathy, that doing exactly what you just said is going to be a lot easier for them than if they did not have that empathy. Yes?
Yes, and also a leader with higher levels of empathy also understands how to put limits in a way that the other person is going to take it in the right way. So levels of empathy is very, very important.
Okay. So as we close, how can people find out more about this conference that's going to be taking place this weekend, please?
Well, the easiest way is go to Google and write Enterprise Agility World Conference, and then you should be able to get the website from there and all the information.
Okay,
Well,
very
if you
good.
use Bing also, Microsoft or any other search engine, I'm not saying just
So
Google,
use
can
your
be any.
search engine to find
Your
Enterprise
future.
Agility World Conference. Yeah, right. Thank you so much, Erich. It was
Thank
really
you,
a
Joyce. It has
pleasure
been a
having
pleasure,
you
and Rom.
here. Rom, you have more?
Yeah, well,
Questions?
you know what? Thank you so much. I think we all learned a lot more about enterprise agility. There is still opportunity for people to register at the conference. It's gonna happen on the weekend. So hey, something fun to do during the weekend. So Joyce, Erich, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so very much. And folks, everyone following us today, thank you and joining us, and thank you for your questions and your comments and your thoughts. And I hope you learned something new about enterprise agility and the upcoming Enterprise Agility World Conference. We're going to have more shows, and coming up next, we're going to talk about going from conflict to non-conflict. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about the future of the supply chain. And I hope you can join us again for yet another episode of It's Your Future with Joyce Gioia. And again, thank you so much for being here with Joyce, Erich, and I. Remember, if you're watching this show on Futures Television as a podcast or as a recorded event in one of the social media platforms, you too can be part of the conversation. Watch for the links on this video so we can continue the conversation on our YouTube channel, and certainly visit Enterprise Agility World Conference. And I hope to see you again on yet another episode of It's Your Future with Joyce Gioia. Thank you so much, and see you next time.
It's Your Future with Joyce Gioia. Want to know what's coming and how to prepare for it? This show is for you. Armed with this information and these insights, our host Joyce Gioia will help you make better decisions both personally and professionally. Joyce will cover all the trends, from social to economic, to workforce, and more. You will have a chance to get your questions answered in a segment we call, I'm Glad You Asked. This is one show you can't afford to miss. Now on Futures Television. It's Your Future with Joyce Gioia.